So all of you kind of raise interesting questions, and the reason I asked you this data question is because I think it's important that we think about what data we're talking about and what we're trying to solve for. And I think each of you talked about this. So I'm going to pick up on the last point that you made, Andrew, which is about kind of integrity of data. And this was also talked a little bit about in the last panel. Actually, it was talked about quite a bit in the last panel too, which is when we think about data being used differently. Look, we're all good at gaming the system. That's human nature. We game the system for everything. So once we start collecting a certain type of data, someone's going to start gaming it. And that's just the way the process works. But how do we think about this integrity of data? How do we think about it as we're using user-generated data plus combining it with public data sets? What is this question around integrity, and what is it we should be thinking about? And I know, Sean, you've thought a lot about this, and we talked about this a little bit on the phone, so I'd love just your thoughts on this too, and from where you've been sitting.
Yeah. I'm not going to rename the panel, though, this time. No, it's, so I think that for data integrity, you know, so it was really interesting even to hear Andrew's description, right? Because one of the things that I took from it is like, man, I would totally build a shiny roof if I lived in Rwanda, right? Because there's more money in that. And taking proxy indicators have value judgments embedded. And I think that when you get into social engineering systems, you stop being able to say that that is a neutral data point or that that data point has integrity. As it may be a proxy, but whether or not your roof is a valuable and useful proxy and how long it's a valuable and useful proxy raises very serious ethical questions about the way that we use public funding, public resources, private funding, and private resources. And it's ultimately, you know, two really quick things that I think live in this entire conversation that I feel like I don't necessarily hear a huge amount about all the time is one, I don't know how many of you know the Matthew effect. The Matthew effect is essentially, given no other intervening force, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It is basically, it's about centralization of power. It's actually, I think the name comes from the Bible, but it's mostly a social research concept. And one of the things that happens in these technology spaces, we are absolutely materially making proxy decisions about the Matthew effect, right? And looking at how it is, when we're talking about centralization, one of the things that we find in data integrity, the vast majority of the governmentally held statistics are held at the national level. In my work, the vast majority of our work is bridging the rural and urban divide. And so Nairobi, in many ways, is a lot more like Baltimore than it is like Kisumu, which is just a couple hundred miles away. And Baltimore is a whole lot more like Nairobi than it is like, say, Salisbury, Maryland, where I grew up, which is a whole different conversation. But the point is just to say that, you know, in a lot of cases, the frames that we're using come from embedded assumptions about our data collection and gathering capacity, and they perpetuate those assumptions. And it's one of those things that, you know, I think your comment was exactly right. We have a problem, I think, where most of our data conversations focus on input data and output data. And we don't necessarily enunciate the rules of the game because of exactly the tension that you bring out, which is, as soon as I know the rules of the game, I'm gonna optimize for the game and get the best direct cash grant I can with a metal roof. Right, and so there's a fundamental kind of core tension in looking at data integrity systems and thinking, are we, you know, is the goal equity, or are we providing selective benefit based on a proxy indicator, and what is the research, what is the social engineering philosophy that underpins the way that we form proxies and the way that we employ proxies? And as a standalone kind of data processing challenge, that stuff is really interesting. When it's applied to social engineering, when it's applied to disaster response, when it's applied to public service delivery, there's a whole second layer of questions about who are we favoring, why, how, and how does that kind of relate to all of the frameworks that should apply.
Andy, I'm going to go to you next because I think this is directly related to some of the research you're doing, but also just the questions that Sean raises.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I entirely echo Sean's point. So I think, you know, people respond to incentives, and you set those incentives when you decide what are the proxies. And you hope that, you know, these proxy means tests are well designed. So you'd expect, so maybe people would, if you had to have a thatched roof in order to get this, because that made it look like you were poor, you might expect people would kind of take the roof off before people came around or whatever, right? Because that's, even within villages, that was the targeting criteria. Maybe the surprising thing is once they got the transfers, what did people do with the money? Well, the number one thing that people spent the money on in this Give Directly evaluation was building roofs, actually, right? So, in addition to people gaming the incentives to get the transfers, it seems like there's also been some kind of signaling of norms, right? So you're telling people what's important. You're saying, look, here's a measure of status, and I'm conveying that by what I'm choosing as my proxy measure. And so everybody responds to that and says, oh, well, now that we know that, the cool people in town had metal roofs, that's what we'll spend money on. It turns out that actually a metal roof is a pretty good investment because you spend a lot of money on the maintenance of a thatch roof. So maybe there's an economic case for this. But I think it's entirely possible that we're signaling norms when we choose these proxies. So, what can we do about that, I think, is a really hard question, because we have this opportunity to use these naturally occurring sources of data to target better. We anticipate they'll be gamed, and in a way we have to keep coming back and checking, do these still map on to the underlying and less gameable things that we care about? So I think that's where this kind of iteration between the development of proxies and then kind of staying one step ahead of the incentives by coming back and seeing to what extent they're being gamed is a challenge.
And sorry, just because other people have smarter things to say, but one really interesting opportunity here is to involve the communities of practice in the formation of proxies and the formation of indicators.
Mm-hmm. The local communities, or the communities of practice, or both?
Both.
I mean, ideally both. But I certainly think that one of the things that's really interesting is the portability of assumption that comes from geographically removed proxy formation. So like if you are saying the roof is the indicator and you are shipping that as a norm, which maybe it was embedded already, maybe it wasn't, like maybe the community has a better indicator.
Yeah. So actually, I'm not going to ask both of you the same exact question. I'm actually going to shift a little bit based on this conversation to say, so where is citizen voice in this? Do we take in, and Agnieszka, you started with it a little bit, of like, where do we get user input? And are we asking the question we want to receive the answer to, or do we actually know what the users want? And how are we thinking about that? And Jed, as you think about this from how you help people design data, how do we think about citizen input? Because we all keep wanting to say we're doing this for citizens, but are the citizens involved?
No, I'm so glad you're asking that question, because I really feel that is still the biggest mistakes that invariably all of us make, whether we're in the policy space or in the development space or governments, that we make decisions on behalf of others without fully understanding the context and how those things play themselves out. So in a way, I think the interesting question here is if you were able to connect to some of the neighbors of that individual with the thatched roof, would you have gotten an additional piece of information that would have better helped you in designing or monitoring the deployment of that program? And to me, I think what's also important about this is if you go back to the point that we should be looking at the ecosystem as a whole, those questions of data integrity, usability of the data, it's really about making sure that there are checks and balances. It's even connected to the Matthew effect in some ways, I feel, because this broadening and separation between the haves, the have-nots, the ones that can access increasingly complex, sophisticated, real-time data, and those that, as I said, for whom the data revolution doesn't even exist because they don't even have a cell phone. There's a need to start filling those gaps and helping, preventing from that divide from increasing even more to the point where it will be much harder to connect the last mile. So I think that in the development space, the citizen or beneficiary voice should be the number one. And so really, rather than beginning to get into our own heads, into our own systems, into our own data, the first step is to go back to the communities. And an example that immediately also comes to mind for me is in fact a community in Nairobi, the Kibera community, which is an underserved community. And for a long time, there have been attempts to invest in improving, the situation in that community. There are security issues, lack of lighting, a huge number of problems related to health and underservicing. But one of the things that seems to have provided a glimmer of hope is, in fact, using data and talking to the community members themselves about their own priorities. What are your priorities first? What are the problems that you're trying to solve? And getting them to help provide ideas about where the lights would be most effective in helping address some of the security issues, and then incorporating that and using data to help drive that process forward. So going back to number one, which is what is the stakeholder input into this? What are the beneficiaries' needs and priorities? And then supporting them through our programs and policies, whether we're government, national or subnational, NGOs, development agencies. Data then becomes a tool to make that more effective.
I like what you just said, because you're sort of creating a collaborative design model, because we face just a very fundamental international development paradox, and frankly, right, a paradox anywhere where there's experts and beneficiaries, or concentrations of money and intention, and less money and more distributed, lives being lived day to day. When I worked at a Natural Resource Governance Institute, which was then called Revenue Watch, I remember being stunned when someone explained to me, well, you can't just, this was about the extraction of oil and minerals from the ground, and whether that money is properly benefiting the communities that live above the resources themselves. And my boss said to me, my boss Karin, about whom I was talking about with Sonal, said to me, well, remember that because this wasn't my field, remember that even if Iraq or some country had all the money and time in the world, they would still need the international companies to give them the support they needed to get this out of the ground and move it around the country. They would still need China or Norway or the US or Brazil or whomever to work on that. So you can't simply say always, when it comes to these kind of informatics questions and observational questions, leave that group, leave the so-called users, so-called beneficiaries to themselves. So instead, what I would advocate is we need to move from a traditional model of program design, which is plan with the best expertise you have available and the best data you already have, embed a series of assumptions, hopefully not too deleterious, into your design, deliver, and then seek the feedback loop. But instead, rather than thinking of it as a line with an arrow at the end that loops back, to think of it as a coil that from the design stage all the way along the way is seeking, more humbly, seeking co-design and feedback at every stage. Some people call that an agile model. There are some assumptions around that too that don't always apply from the tech world to the development world, as certain consultants and vendors might advise you they do. A last point I'll make is going back to the incentives point, which is that as we look at how are our incentives built into our program design, our data collection, our data delivery, and our measurement, what's our incentive to get the next cycle of funding from whoever we're getting it from, to have the running room of 100 million. One of the amazing things about that is that you can co-design what your accountability looks like, being informed by what you learn in your first month and in your second month and in your third month, before somebody like the World Bank or one of the big donors, or the government, one of the donor governments comes knocking and says, well, we needed you to have gotten 100,000 Twitter likes within a year, or we needed you to have 100,000 new kiosks built to deliver information or to deliver diapers, whatever it happens to be, or syringes within a year, because those measurements may turn out to be totally inapplicable. They may be vanity metrics. Google vanity metrics, there's some good work being done in our community around that right now.
So we're going to open it up to questions. Please wait for the mic to come to you, because it'll be easier for us to hear. And feel free to, raise your hands and somebody will come get you the question. And if you wouldn't mind telling, just kind of giving your name too.
Hi, my name is Caroline. I want to thank you all for such an amazing panel, and also shout out to the microbiologist, because I'm a biology major and working with large sets of data, so real talk.
All right.
So one of the things I think that you guys really addressed really well is how the value of any decisions made based on data are really only as valid as the data set itself. And so and I thought it was really great that we examined sort of the almost fleeting value of proxy indicators as they may change over time. But one thing I wanted to ask was, how do you anticipate blind spots in the data? For example, with much user-generated data, it's based on text, but a large swath of the people who live in the developing world can't read or write. So how do things like illiteracy create blind spots in your data, and how do you correct for those blind spots? Thank you.
Want to take that?
Sure,
Sean?
I love that one. So 2 things. The first is the value, just to provide an alternative, the value of a data set is very often deeply correlated to the ability of an institution to hear what is reflected in that data set. And one of the things that is really interesting about the institutional feedback loop conversation is that there are a huge number of platforms for citizen voice. There are more platforms now than there ever have been. But we haven't developed institutions that necessarily internalize them well. So like the White House's We the People petitioning site is amazing in terms of what it welcomes, but it doesn't guarantee any outcome. And so like if what you get is a letter that tells you the rote government position, like that wasn't a good use of 100,000 signatures. Just to say, like, I think it's like when we're talking about all of this, in terms of blind spots and in terms of what the value of a particular body of data is, it's related to how it's used. The blind spots piece, so in any research method, hopefully you would A/B test a few things. And I think that one of the things that happens is that we're not very good at building systems of equivalence. So like if we interact over voice, I couldn't necessarily tell you what the legal value of that is as compared to if we were interacting over text messaging, or if we were interacting over email, or if we were interacting over contracts. And so one of the real lags on institutional listening is actually building systems that equate different signaling behaviors from people in different formats. And so looking at the source of citizen-generated data, in an ideal world, what we're doing is we're comparatively testing voice and text and images and emoji and sensors and like whatever it is that you can get people to engage with. I think that very often, unfortunately, the kind of funding and market model really focuses organizations on single hypotheses and single platform interaction, where most relationships are conducted over multiple platforms. So I think the lens of how we measure and understand what works in a particular community is a little askew. And I also think that despite like the hours of time that people spend saying that we're not looking for a silver bullet, the fact that we continue to invest in single approach interventions, single approach problems, single approach solutions, single platform technologies, those are all really clear indicators that like, we're not looking for a silver bullet, but if you find one, we'll fund it. And so, I think that there is how do we invest in building equivalent understandings across different data sources and different technologies and different social engineering approaches. And when we understand them as an equivalence, I think a lot of the blind spot problem goes away.
Andrew, do you want to take?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to jump in. So a couple things. One is, I guess, maybe this is part of the reason that traditional survey research and the other complementary methods shouldn't be declared dead just yet, is that we do need to figure out how broad is access to these technologies and how what is the share of people who are participating in these things, so that at least we can say something about who's been incorporated and who's not. So we're aware of the boundaries of our understanding to a greater extent than we would be otherwise. The other thing, I really like this point about sort of institutional listening, right? So, in a way, the constraint is you have to think about how to structure the data that comes in so that the right people can make use of it. And in many contexts, especially where you're talking about influencing governments at high level, that's a really sharp trade-off, right? The way that you can present information, it requires you to put a lot of structure on the way that people engage with it, and that may make it harder for some people to get involved. But that's not always the case, in fact, right? So there are some instances where you're interested in sort of the agency of the people themselves who are providing this information, and those might be cases where this trade-off doesn't bind in quite the same way. We did an earlier experiment on sort of holding schools and teachers to account in Uganda that actually sort of tackled a bit this problem. We had a technocratically designed, so this was about community monitoring through scorecards about the schools. We had this technocratically designed, best case, gold standard NGO and ministry-driven scorecard for schools, right? That we thought was, the technocrats in the room thought this is what matters, what everybody should measure. This is what will really drive results in the school. And this would be disseminated back to stakeholders, and it'd go up to the districts who manage these schools. Then we had another version that was kind of like the kumbaya version, where we didn't really tell them what to measure at all. We let people decide in what format did they want to provide information about what was going on in their school, what were the important things and whatnot. And so then we ran a kind of a horse race. Which of these was going to have bigger impacts on things like inputs of teacher presence and things like learning outcomes in the schools. And the technocratic stuff got completely wiped out, right? So that participatory thing, the act of engaging with it, actually had much greater impacts than what we thought was the better measurement. And so I think there are going to be instances where this trade-off isn't quite as binding, and where there might be real gains to kind of letting go a little bit of how you think you should structure the data.
I would just give
Go ahead.
Caroline a very shorthanded answer as the comms guy. Go and ask. Go into that community and find out how they're already trading information about what works and doesn't work, even if it turns out to only be over tea at 2 local cafes.
Seeing a lot of hot nodding heads here. Next question.
Just so everyone knows, if you don't get a chance to ask your question, all of the Twitter handles for both of our panels are listed on your program, so feel free to tweet at them using the hashtag.
Yeah, Brian Pagels from Forum 1. I wanted to follow up on some of this thread about kind of feedback and expert opinion versus kind of what beneficiaries are looking for. What happens if the disconnect or the difference in opinion is much more dramatic than, say, the example you just cited? What if the disconnect is something as extreme as, are we addressing the right problem, or is the entire proposed solution or design something beneficiaries want versus experts saying this is what you should want? What do you do in a scenario like that where you have completely conflicting data and opinions?
Agnieszka, you want to take that?
No, I mean, I think that's a great question, and hopefully you're doing it in a context or with an organization that allows you to go back to the drawing board if there's that much of a disconnect. Because from my perspective, if there is that much of a disagreement, it's a non-starter. You really shouldn't be implementing interventions that don't have the buy-in of the beneficiaries or the local context. That's a recipe for disaster. And I can't tell you how many times I've also seen examples of small or mid-scale or large-scale projects that involved, I don't know, putting in place a well that was just designed externally, and then a year later the well breaks down. Nobody in the community knows how to fix it. Sustainability is gone. And then it gets to be more complex from that. So I think I would assume that if there is that much of a discrepancy, go back to the drawing board, to the co-design, because Jed is absolutely right. It's a process of taking the conversation to the local level where it's happening, and jointly determining what the question actually really is, how it's perceived. Perception and reality is a very fine line sometimes. And then how to collaborate on the ultimate solution. And it may be a blending. It may be a lowering of the technology. It may be providing something much simpler, but that is consistent with the local custom, is accepted, etc. I think I'll take this opportunity to also connect this to our sustainable development goals context here. We just recently adopted these as a planet. It's the first time that we're trying to make a cohesive joint goals that are that specific and that far-reaching. But at the end of the day, it's not those goals as they're listed out with the 144 or so more targets. It's what happens at the local village level that is a local priority, whether it's access to their water or whether there's the presence of a particular health facility within a walkable distance. That's the roll-up of the impact that will either nudge things forward or not. So I know I sound like a broken record, but you have to go back to the local level, to the stakeholders there. And I know it's harder, it's slower, it does not fit in the context of the broader timelines related to budgets that even agencies like the one that I work for need to in some ways be under the mercy of, but that's the reality.
Jed, you're consulting to a lot of these organizations. How are you helping them think through, are we even asking the right questions? And what happens if we aren't?
That's sort of what I was about to ask about, because I know Brian has been in this situation. I assume, Sean has, and I've certainly been in a situation where someone, whether a partner, a client, an organization, has an idea of what to do and what the intervention will look like, or what the website will look like, or what the data strategy will look like, and it's very, very important. I trust best the consultant who tells me no when I'm asking them to do something, who says, we can't do that and here's why, and then we can have a discussion. But I think it can be very hard to say when there's $10 million from the World Bank or from the Omidyar Network on the line, or from the Gates Foundation, Podshape Gates Foundation. So the question becomes, and this is something that all of us in the room can think about, when can you say no or wait to serve as a proxy, rather than seeking proxy indicators for something you can't know because you're not on the ground, to educate yourself enough or to empower yourself enough to be a proxy resistor, and to, if not an insurgent, and say, wait, the design of this program, the design of this grant, the design of this research project, not to mention the places where Brian and I more often work, the design of this web strategy, the design of this digital measurement strategy, or mobile/blog strategy, whatever it happens to be, is ill-conceived because there's a lack of literacy. To use Caroline's example, I heard a great example recently where they were going to measure health intervention better over time by getting the thumbprint of the rural workers, and 6 months later they would come back and they had these great thumbprint scanners that they had been donated from somewhere. The workers they were measuring were bamboo workers. It's the one thing a bamboo worker doesn't have after a few years, a thumbprint. So don't bring a fax machine to a beach party. Take the time to find things out, and if you don't know, take your best guess and say, hey, wait, maybe even though the grant deadline is coming up, or even though we have the program officer from that foundation coming in tomorrow, don't just ask questions to your beneficiaries, ask questions to the people further up the value chain, controlling the money and the decision making, because sometimes they will never have the chance to ask the person in the village.
Just so you know, this audience not everybody knows what a fax machine is.
I was gonna say, don't bring a fax machine anywhere. This is, come on, man.
Sean, I'm short, so sometimes I can use them,
Locally appropriate technology, ladies and gentlemen. I think the one thing that's coming out, though, and I think one thing is really important to recognize, is that there's a market here. That anytime you have revenue streams and procurement models, this is a very real market. And right now, the market is not incredibly well designed to function in iterative design environments. And regardless of what part of that you're taking, or which iterative design, whether it's feedback or indicator or local consultation, doing this well costs more than doing it badly in the short term, and ideally costs less in the long term. But you have to have a longer time horizon on your investment from the funder perspective, and we have to be willing to challenge that funding model as a community, I think, to get the results, to get the kind of design results that we're proud of.
So we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask each of you one final question. What do you want people to take away from today? And if you were just leave 2 comments, what would they be? So I'll start with you, Andrew.
So I guess I would say that from the research perspective, our ability to learn about how and why things are working is sort of really transforming as new kinds of data become available. And that those are really serious opportunities. I think that there are still important gaps in the kinds of data that we're collecting and blind spots that result from that. So things like higher frequency data in developing countries are really important. There are instances, for example, of there's a famous, in some circles, a famous book called about the financial diaries. It asks people to record on a daily basis kind of what were they spending, saving, taking out, and whatnot, right? This completely changes the picture of how you think about the financial situation of poor people, right? So people weren't just poor with no money in the bank account. They were lending some days and borrowing some days, and there were all these flows going back and forth. So I think at the same time as we have all these new opportunities, there are still some gaps, and the opportunity to pick up new kinds of data that are at a more fine-grained level, that are higher frequency. I think there's still a lot that can be learned, especially as we see this growth in the number of these transactions that are digital in nature, and so can be brought in that way.
From my perspective, so I think again, while clearly there's a need for more data, more sophisticated tools, more opening of data, I would argue that the key message here is to get a greater proportion, especially in the international development context, of individuals to actually use the data that is there for their decision making. So to do more of the things that we are even guilty of here, to not keep data sets to themselves or information, to share it, combine it, use it, and uncover potentially some quality issues with that data as well. I think the other key message here is listen to the local level and input and incorporate that into the design of any investments or interventions that are made. And last but not least, since we're talking about a data ecosystem with so many different interconnected looping parts, there is a role for everyone. And that's also why I was really thrilled to see that Georgetown is bringing us together, because it'll take partnerships, it'll take collaborations, and different groups and individuals completing different parts of the puzzle.
I'd start by going back to what I said before. Let's stop outsourcing the thoughtful design work. Let's take the time to educate ourselves enough to co-design with beneficiaries, with the people who are going to be using the results of our work, even if they're just down the hall. And that sometimes includes asking harder questions to the people who are telling us the design that they've walked in with an assumption, the assumptions behind their instructions. And the other thing I would say is just to remember that you may think you have peaches, but you might have apples and oranges. So work very hard to check on interoperability and comparability. Just because it's all there doesn't mean that it's telling the story you'd like it to tell.
Now I'm struggling to follow the fruit thing. So I guess if there are two things, like the first thing for me would be every information relationship, whether it's explicit or not, is a financial relationship, it's a power relationship, it's a contract relationship, and it's a technology relationship. Every single information exchange that we have has elements of those four things embedded. And so it's very difficult to have conversations about it when we're not supplying sustainable revenue, when we're not applying good ethical and legal principles, when we're not building dispute resolution and community consultation and building in the kind of things that you normally see in a contract. The technology and data ecosystem that we're building is getting good right-ish, but we're not bringing all of those pieces together, and the pieces that we're missing out are the ones that are creating the divides today that we'll have to fix tomorrow. And so I think, being really holistic about how we look at information relationships, whether we think of them as technology relationships or data relationships, is really important. And the second part of that then is that it's not an entirely zero-sum game, but there's a lot. We are ultimately talking about how we allocate resources and how we make decisions that engineer different and better societies. And it's really, really important to recognize that the vast majority of the decisions that we make, the vast majority of the times that we say, let's not let good be the enemy of perfect, is the time that we make a decision that disadvantages someone that we end up kind of lamenting later. And then the last thing that I will say to end on a like more positive note is that what's happening here, what's happening in this room and in this new institute, is one of the only opportunities I've seen, and an incredibly exciting opportunity to really dig in and build a better engine and a better machine, a better institution around being an advocate, a research center, around developing what better practice looks like, and communicating it and adapting it to the institutional structures that will need to hear it and listen and adapt along the way. And so, you know, as a plug, I guess, I would really recommend that people look at this event as a starting point, but also at this institution and this group of people as the beginning of a community that will hopefully be able to really dig in and provide solutions that we can all be really proud of, you know, and not leave people behind as the data revolution evenly distributes. I'm sorry.
We're going to have apples, oranges, and peaches now at the even distribution. Andrew, Sean, thank you, and thanks to all of you for participating in this panel. I think what you hear from both the first panel and the second panel is that there's a very rich conversation as to how we think about moving forward on data and what are the ways of talking about this. But more importantly, in this conversation, I want to take away is how global the conversation is, because this is not a conversation with boundaries of nationhood. This is a conversation of things moving across boundaries, and we need to be thinking about how do we use international, national, local data in ways that allow us to compare Baltimore to Nairobi, and how do we think about that? So we're not siloing just because there's boundaries of nationhood, but to think about data differently. And the second, which I took away certainly, is static versus dynamic. We tend to create for static spaces. And I think and certainly through this conversation, is that dynamism is constant. And so how do policymakers think about living in a constantly adaptive, dynamic environment, as opposed to creating something for 10 years, going back and researching it, but thinking about this coil, and how are we constantly learning and creating the dynamism that is needed, because the world is moving at such a rapid pace that we need to somewhat keep up with it. And finally, to all of you, keep asking us questions, whether it's via Twitter or the emails that you've gotten. Send us questions, because this is the beginning of a conversation, as Sean put, and this is not the end of a conversation. What we're trying to figure out is what needs to be done, and what's the best place for a place like Georgetown to be taking the leadership in, both from whether it's talking about the ethics of data, whether it's talking about the principles of use of data, but what are the best questions, and then who should we be partnering with? Because this by itself is not an one institution problem. This is a multi-institution, multi-stakeholder problem. So we really do look forward to your input on this. And with that, I think I bring Ed back up here, don't I, to close, or are we closing?
I think so.
Okay. So let me just close and say thank you all for participating. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. But please don't see this as an end. See this as a beginning. And we look forward to more of these. Thank you.